It's time to hand things over to Kwasu.
Thank you everybody for coming, especially after Halloween. It's nice to see you all here. Thank you very much to Claire, Rebecca, Louise, Mike, John, everybody for helping put this together for us. I'd like to begin, if the technology allows, by showing a very, very small, short clip from my favorite film of all time. It's a film by Chris Marker called Le Jeté. It's a 28-minute short film that has no moving images, they're all stills. And I think in so many ways this particular scene is a really good way of thinking about how it is that the lodestars of my book kind of cohere with one another. So, perfect timing. The synopsis of the film, just to kind of give you some context in terms of what it is that I'm about to show you, is as follows. This is from IMDb, which is pretty accurate. Time travel, still images, past, present, and future, and the aftermath of World War III. The tale of a man, a slave, sent back and forth in and out of time to find a solution to the world's fate, to replenish its decreasing stocks of food, medicine, and energies. And in doing so, resulting in a perpetual memory of a lone female, life, death, and past events that are recreated on an airport jetty. So, this is, by many accounts, the most beautiful scene in the film, but everything that I'm about to say kind of comes out of this.
Around the 50th day, they meet in a museum filled with ageless animals. Now they have hit the bullseye. Thrown at the right moment, he may stay there and move without trouble. Seems also to be tamed. She welcomes as a natural phenomenon the ways of this visitor who comes and goes, who exists, talks, laughs with her, stops talking, listens to her, then vanishes.
Okay. A museum filled with ageless animals. It strikes me that a not small portion of the petrified flora and fauna one witnesses in the scene that you just watched from Chris Marker's 1962 masterpiece Le Jeté, my favorite film of all time, is avian, birds. The last frame of this museum sequence features a disembodied hand pointing at a bird. Immediately, I think of an aphorism often attributed to Jiddu Krishnamurti that goes, "The day you teach the child the name of the child will never see the bird again." Why might this be? Might it be because the fundamentally, irresolvably, inescapably differential nature of language and semiological science systems more generally means that meaning comes to usurp or supplement or supplant or suppress, double and halve, and perhaps only hope for a sense of immediacy behind or in spite of the word for the bird? Might it be because behind or in spite of the word for the bird, a generalization of organization for a complicated myriad melange of partial presences that chorused, like the frequencies of birdsong we can and cannot hear to be there, is vacuated, vanished, made vacuous, albeit conspicuously absent by the word that stands for and behind it. That gone, by way of what some people called aphanesis, is the present intensity of and wonder for the being of the bird. How puzzling all these changes are. I'm never sure what I'm going to be from one minute to another, says Alice. How strange it is to be anything at all, sang the band Neutral Milk Hotel once. Or as Hopkins, my favorite poet, says in a poem titled The Wind Hover, another name for a common kestrel, a bird, "My heart in hiding stirred for a bird." Or is it that the child doesn't have the time to hold that moment that time gaveth and tooketh away in place? That it changed, withdrew, translated, diminished with language, yes, but also in and because of time. Time taken, held up, lost, misaligned, misspent, ablated in the restructuring of a resolutely active finitude and its diminutions of attention, ability, care, in the dire straits of survival and status, the troubles of pleasure and pain, the brittle hope and hubris of the appearance of gain and the solid certainty of loss, again and again and yet again, once more and more. And that child will grow up in time, and the bird they saw, once nameless, in a time of an old now gone, in which they marveled at, as Hopkins might say, that morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn, drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level underneath him steady air, and striding high there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy. Maybe that child will think that time occasions the conditions for its own misuse. Maybe that child will think as Carmen McRae does as she sings in a 1982 single, Speak Low, lyrics that read, "Love is pure gold and time's a thief. We're late, darling, we're late." Maybe there's little to be said or done between the stock of hours in infinity and depreciations of infinity in the stock of hours, that time cannot be abused or made, killed or kept. Maybe time has accelerated you past, ahead, behind yourself, and it's harder to see that you're that child. I'm that child. Maybe through the accretions of Weltschmerz, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing, that bird from long ago for which the heart in hiding in the future will stir, will feel very far away. Maybe that child, then an adult, will, in the potential despair of a Zeitkranken, a time sickness, wish that moment and that bird and their life could be rendered into something like a museum filled with ageless animals, suspended like the wind hover in his ecstasy, in and through which they could hurl and glide and move without trouble, in which they could be without the anxiety of loss, in which they could rebuff the big wind of time. And maybe that child will think how lucky, in all the steady and fearful erosions of something so bright and fearful as the bird, they found themselves still lucky to be at all, to be able to think, with maybe a soft, warm other near to them, one maybe a billion times told lovelier than even the bird, whom they too would wish to join them in this museum, to perhaps lose slowly and beautifully together, to not rush past a smear of blur of a bird, to stop, go back, to see again for the first time, with new eyes, as Proust says, to speak, laugh, listen, and never, like the bird, disappear again. Well, I think that we shouldn't forget that the museum is one of the heterotopias of infinitely accumulating time that Foucault names 21 years before I was born in Of Other Spaces. And perhaps back then he's saying there are heterotopias of indefinitely accumulating time, for example, museums and libraries. Museums and libraries have become heterotopias in which time never stops building up and topping its own summit. Whereas in the 17th century, even at the end of the century, museums and libraries were the expression of an individual choice. By contrast, the idea of accumulating everything, of establishing a sort of general archive, the will to enclose in one place all times, all epochs, all forms, all tastes, the idea of constituting a place of all times that is itself outside of time and inaccessible to its ravages. The project of organizing in this way a sort of perpetual and indefinite accumulation of time in an immobile place. This whole idea belongs to our modernity. The museum and the library are heterotopias that are proper to Western culture of the 19th century. He goes on to say, opposite those heterotopias that are linked to the accumulation of time, there are those linked, on the contrary, to time in its most flowing, transitory, precarious aspect, to time in the mode of the festival. These heterotopias are not oriented toward the eternal, they are rather absolutely temporal. Such, for example, are the fairgrounds, these marvelous empty sites on the outskirts of cities that teem once or twice a year with stands, displays, heteroclite objects, wrestlers, snake women, fortune tellers, and so forth. Quite recently, a new kind of temporal heterotopia has been invented, vacation villages. This was back in the 60s. That offer a compact 3 weeks of no or slow time. You see, moreover, that through the two forms of heterotopia that come together here, the heterotopia of the festival, where rediscovery abolishes time, yet the experience is just as much the rediscovery of time, in that it is as if the entire history of humanity, reaching back to its origin, were accessible in a sort of immediate knowledge, end quote. Time travel as an archaeology of knowledge, excavatory, making apparent that which is rendered invisible in the ready work of living and using, neither of which come to us complete, fully worked out, nor in a full sense of abeyance. It is this just as much as it is an affective desire to move away from knowledge, to remake knowledge, if the object of knowledge is what is real, that is present to hand, that time travel serves. Indeed, I don't think we need to refer to the current and ongoing transatlantic reworking of the already questionable work of the museum, the library, the archive, what's going on at the Smithsonian in the States under the Trump administration. It's easy to see, clearly, I think, how it is that they work as powerful ideological apparatuses of retro-causal influence on past, present, and future time. Who controls the museum, the library, the archive, controls what is seen or forgotten, what appears and disappears as real and unreal, as history or fantasy, as credulous and incredible. Who controls the museum, the library, the archive, controls what is worthy of remembrance and neglect, of what was or could be, how and when life and living was done before, how, when, and why it failed or succeeded, what it looked like, how it was recorded, what it means or meant. To control the museum, the library, the archive, is to delineate the conditions, content, and conceptions of not only change, but what we must or need to credit with a belief of changelessness and or a changeless belief. What is possible, what can be recalled and projected, propagated, what can and cannot degrade, what is or isn't lossless. If the child thinks like this, then the child will be now thinking like a time traveler. So now just some general remarks with a slightly more improvisational mode. That's the cover of the book. It's not out yet, so futures and stuff, I guess. I think I'll just take you through some general remarks and reflections about the structure of the book, and I guess some of the intuitive motivations that propelled me. It's broken into sort of 6 general chapters. There's, strangely enough, 3 chapters about time, because time is really difficult to talk about. It's a very strange thing. Then I discussed trauma, which I think, as the title of the book suggests, is in so many ways the fulcrum, the upon which a not small portion of my conclusions and my claims depends. And it's a very, very difficult thing. It's kind of a downer, sorry. To make the postulate, or certainly to make the assertion of the provocation that time and trauma are linked inextricably. I'm not the first to do it, I'm not the only one to do it, but a lot of people try to rebuff this in some sense. Then it goes on to discuss time travel, specifically looking in and through the cinema as not only a kind of dream machine, but in some sense a time machine, necessarily so. Then the figure of the time traveler is something that I turn my attention toward. Like, why do this? Why travel in time? A not small portion of the time travelers in 20th and 21st century time travel cinema die. Well, they're motivated by something that is exceedingly traumatic that they try to, in some sense, retroactively redress, and in so doing instantiate the very conditions for them to travel back in the first place. It's constant looping, etc. There's a lot of interesting theory and critique taking place in contemporary, I guess you could call it time travel studies, it doesn't really exist, which really concerns the kind of gender dimensions of time travelers, which I find really fascinating. A not small portion of these guys who fail at being time travelers are dudes. And it's interesting to see how it is potentially that there are gender dimensions insofar as an actual temporal being or temporal existence, and how that might change your motivations or use of a time machine. And I do talk about time machines, but that's when the physicists step in and, they really like to lean heavy on this particular hedge industry. And so I tend to avoid it because I'm not a physicist, despite the fact that all I've been reading for the past maybe 4 years is quantum field theory. But there's some interesting ways in which the natural phenomena of relativity, special relativity, general relativity, speed, the speed of light, gravity, and so on, can instantiate something resembling like a time travel experience. But I'm more interested typically in more difficult things. I don't have an answer, but I find the challenge to be certainly productive. So, questions of entropy, I'm not going to go into a lot of the physics anyway. But entropy is a very interesting way of measuring time, how things tend toward higher degrees of disorderedness. And if you could make I have all of these diagrams, sorry to my partner, they're like everywhere, of what I call entropy engines. How it is that you can kind of, in some sense, create a cinema, a screen of different times in which different configurations of entropy, in some sense, create different realities. Not a multiverse per se, but just different versions of the same timeline with different arrangements of entropy. And if you could somehow align them with the time in which you are, you could in some way step into another time by exchanging different entropic conditions. I think it would probably disintegrate somebody, or they might explode. It requires some insanely precise math, which I think is kind of impossible. And I love that because a not small portion of time travel films, something happens to the time traveler. Time travel is painful. In Le Jeté, there are these startling images of the traveler traveling, and there's this grimace on his face, etc., and so forth. So the idea of being in some way in your own past is in some way troubling, but the motivation for looking at that in that particular way, or trying to challenge it, was the result of a conversation that I had with my partner in Accra. I asked her, I said, if you have a time machine, what would you use it for? A lot of people, in science fiction use time machines for this Marty McFly type of situation. You go back, you game the system, you get the stock numbers for the following day, what have you, and you kind of use it for specifically pecuniary increase. But she said that she'd go back and reconstitute her relationship with her own trauma so as to return to the present and be, in some sense, lighter. And I was like, that's one of the most radical and interesting, and I think most difficult suggestions of the use of a time machine that I've ever heard. And so the book opens with a sort of a meditation on what I'm calling the Elven time machine. That's her last name. And it's related very much to sort of this question of time and trauma. So that's kind of the structure of the book, but in a little bit more detail. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay.
Doing great.
All right, great. Okay. So, we'll take time and trauma together. This, as I said, was kind of coming out of my readings into Foundations of Physics. Quantum field theory, things like the Casimir effect, zero-point energy, entropy, vacuum pressure, eigenstates and ground states, quantum fluctuations, dark energy, probability, measure problems. It's all fancy talk for basically the same intuitions that we have in the humanities. Don't let them fool you. But this led me to the Greeks, surprise. Specifically the pre-Socratics and their search for this thing that they call the arche, the first principle, what it is that the cosmos is founded on. And there's, the Milesian school in particular had so many nominees in its elemental way. Thales thought it was water, Anaximenes thought it was air, Anaximander thought it was the aporon, this kind of weird void. Heraclitus, who I favor, considered, not just because I'm an Aries, he considered it to be fire. And Parmenides considered it to be water. But in a lot of the translations of the Heraclitean fragments, there's this phrase that pops up often: war is the father of, so his consideration of what the arche is, the prime principle of the cosmos. He says war is the father of all and king of all. And this word, Ptolemos, this word here, I found that a kind of a dissatisfactory, maybe overly specific rendition of a somewhat general intuition of tension, perhaps. And the other phrase that's often sort of attributed to his statement of what the arche is in terms of it being fire or pyro-based in some sense, is that all things are exchanged for fire, and fire for all things, as wares are exchanged for gold, and gold for wares. But the word Ptolemos is typically translated as war or battle, but there's increasing and interesting evidence that we get from, for example, Robert Beeks's Etymological Dictionary of Greek, that I think is far more intuitively accurate. I think war and battle are way too specific for what it is that Heraclitus, it seems to me, intuitively is trying to get at. It's associated with, for instance, words like palo, to poise, to sway, to brandish, pelemizo, to shake, to cause to quiver or tremble, struggle at the bow in order to bend it, and perhaps salo, to pluck, twitch a string with the fingers, to sing to a harp, chant praises, possibly deriving from the Proto-Indo-European pel, to beat, push, or drive. And it's also related to other words like the Latin pello, to push, drive, strike, to rout, conquer, defeat, to strike a chord, to touch, to move. This is beyond just, I think, conflict in a kind of banal-based sense. But also words like pelpo, to touch softly, to stroke, pat, caress, to smite, to terrify. There's just interesting intuitions, I think, that for me were better served etymologically, looking at the sort of source for what these terms might mean. And the other word is, this is just how you pronounce it, pir, which is fire. And the translations for pir are typically a fire, a funerary fire, a sacrificial fire, but also like lightning and fever. And that feels more accurate to what it feels like to me anyway, to be in time. And what I'm left with, I think, is thinking and experiencing time as a field of touch, of drives, of driving, of being driven, of contact, of caressing, of clamor. We call this many names, such as event or crisis or love or death or sacrifice, mourning and mournings, of appearance and disappearance, of a neighborhood or region of illumination, whether a flash or a withering watchfire, of startlement, of shock, of trauma, of onset fever, mirage, of quivering, shaking, fear, and trembling. So I think, in short, on my reflections, I conclude that time is, if I could put it in one sentence, an intentional field of force. And that's why I was reading a lot of physics, like quantum field theory is really trying to get at some of these questions. So that's time in short. Time travel. So I talk a lot about this idea of splice projection and the mechanics of cinema, very much in keeping with how it is that we experience time. It's these kind of iterative moments that seem to have a continuum, that seem to be in so many ways stitched together seamlessly, but are so dependent on their own self-interruption, much like a splice. To splice a rope, for instance, you have to cut it in half, but in halving it, you also double it. So there's this constant tension between splitting and doubling that takes place not only in cinema as an art form, but I think in your life, right? You're constantly splitting and reattaching yourself, on and on and on. forward and forward and forward. So discrete momenta and this kind of illusion of continuity was something I was really interested in terms of what time travel tries to suspend, kind of like this wind hover, kind of above it a little bit. Never outside of it, but just to slow it down a little bit, to kind of study it, to see twice is also to see double. But maybe seeing once is to know nothing, but seeing twice is to know half. Like, so if you go back and you see it again, you might know half as much more than you did, which was nothing the first time you went through. And this happens all the time with time travelers. You're watching the film and you're like, surely they're gonna know X, Y, and Z this time, and they never do, right? Sometimes it's an ostensibly infinite series of repetitions that produces a paucity of knowledge, right? So this idea of doubling, splicing, and continuums and so on, we'll see there. And I think I'll literally end the book on, partially on this quote. There's a lot of hiding in the book. But I end on this quote by Proust, which I think really gets at this idea of seeing twice and seeing double, or seeing again, the necessity of sort of study in order to derive knowledge. Like you're being pushed through your life at such a high speed that it's very difficult to kind of really know what the hell's going on, right? It'd be much more informative if you could do it at a slower pace. So Proust is talking about this. He says, I say that the concept of time travel, screened, remembered, or felt, makes the man himself apparent, rendering externally visible in the colors of the spectrum the intimate composition of those worlds which we call individual persons, and which, without the aid of art, we should never know. A pair of wings, birds again, a different mode of breathing which would enable us to traverse infinite space, would in no way help us, for if we visited Mars or Venus keeping the same senses, they would clothe in the same aspect as the things of the earth everything that we should be capable of seeing. The only true voyage of discovery, the only fountain of eternal youth, would be not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold, or new eyes, or two eyes, or doubled eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universes that each of them beholds, that each of them is. And this we can contrive, I say, with time travel and time machines. With devices like these, we do really fly from start to start. So there's this necessity of seeing again in order to know a little bit. So that's time travel. And maybe, penultimately, the time traveler. I did a pub conversation talking about this book in Morecambe at Smuggler's Den, which apparently is one of the oldest pubs in England. And it's open to the public, so any random person could just show up there. And it was a really interesting exercise. But one of the questions that I asked a lot of the patrons there, a lot of whom were drunk, was what? I was talking about Marx and, the accelerationism and capitalism, and this guy was just like, why? I thought this was about time travel, man. So it was tense, but illuminating. And I asked a lot of the people there, like, if you could use a time machine, why would you do it? Knowing, as I've sketched out, some of the dangers that are involved in being temporal in any way, let alone messing with that ostensible timeline. And the answers that people gave were really telling, I think. A not small portion of them were retroactive. A lot of people were like, I want to go back and see Jimi Hendrix live, or I want to go see my grandma. This one person, I think few in number, she might have been the only one, said that she'd go forward into the future to see, quote, if we'd made it. I was like, what do you mean? So she was like, just to see if we survive. And I was like, okay. And I found that an interesting, answer. I was like, what's the underlying predicate there? Is it in some sense to relieve you of the work like now in order to make that possible? Or to kind of, in some sense, relieve the pressure that like, no, it's fine, we make it anyway. Like right now it feels that the future is extremely doubtful, but if I could travel into a future that exists and somehow we still survive and we're still there, the pressure of the present is in some sense alleviated. I found that fascinating. I also found fascinating the fact that there's this real difficulty in our lives, I think, in general, to like be present. I see a lot of, people in the wellness industrial complex and elsewhere talking about presence and so on, presence of mind, being present with other people, active listening, what have you. But I feel as if time is, as I say, going back to this kind of fire, this kind of tension, this kind of fever, it's really difficult to be where you think you are and to kind of be present in a radical sense. There's this constant tension pulling you both forward and backward. In some sense, you're always delayed behind yourself. And to quote Heidegger, Dasein is always ahead of itself. Being is always ahead of itself. You're always becoming who you are. Much in the same way that Miles Davis, a quote I love saying, he's like, it took me my whole life to play like myself. So whenever he was in Birdland in Harlem or he was in Paris, like he wasn't finished. His style was ill-wrought, despite the fact that everybody could so readily ascribe it. There's a constant tension of becoming and remembering. So I think insofar as talking about this, how the time traveler in some sense exploits this, we turn to Catherine Malibu, who describes in the opening of a book that I really loathe that I didn't quote in the book. If I could go back in time, this would open my account as it does hers. The book is called The Ontology of the Accident, which is a fantastic title. But she says, in the usual order of things, lives run their course like rivers. The changes and metamorphoses of life due to vagaries and difficulties, or simply the natural unfolding of circumstance, appear as the marks and wrinkles of a continuous, almost logical process of fulfillment that leads ultimately to death. In time, one eventually becomes who one is. One becomes only who one is. Bodily and psychic transformations do nothing but reinforce the permanence of identity, caricaturing or fixing it, but never contradicting it. They never disrupt identity. This gradual existential and biological incline, which can only ever transform the subject into itself, does not, however, obviate the powers of plasticity of the same identity that houses itself beneath an apparently smooth surface, like a reserve of dynamite hidden under the peachy skin of being for death. I mean, awesome. As a result of serious trauma, or sometimes for no reason at all, the path splits, and a new unprecedented persona comes to live with the former person, and eventually takes up all the room. An unrecognizable persona whose present comes from no past, whose future harbors nothing to come, an absolute existential improvisation. A form born of the accident, born by accident, a kind of accident. A funny breed, time travelers, I think. A monster whose apparition, the stranger who visits this lady at this museum, laughs with her and then vanishes. It's kind of a ghost. A monster whose apparition cannot be explained as any genetic anomaly. A new being comes into the world for a second time out of a deep cut that opens in a biography. I wish I had that quote in the book. It's perfect. So I think that really encapsulates this, the tension of the time traveler and what it is that the time machine and time travel more extensively can allow a time traveler to manipulate. These kind of self-interruptions that occur as a result of being in time. I think, in terms of the time machine, I think I've mentioned this earlier in terms of entropy engines, but a lot of contemporary particle physics and high energy physics are really interested in black holes, and this idea that there's an inextricable relationship between gravity and time, that in some sense time is gravity, that because the cosmos, if you think of it as a fabric, is even distributions of pools, if you will, of gravity, kind of sinks that warp it in undulous ways, that time moves at different speeds, at different rates in different regions, associated with higher degrees of gravity and so on. And I find that to be quite fascinating because physics, in so many ways, as we understand it, is predicated on things that it can't itself explain, like what a measurement is, for instance. But also time is this kind of perennial problem that sometimes can be monodirectional. Sometimes you don't even need time for an equation to balance. Sometimes you get positrons, which are particles that ostensibly, like, you can measure it moving backwards in time. It's odd. Questions of free will, how it is that a time machine in some sense might seem to be the instantiation of a radical free will, that I can kind of go any when, right? But if you step into a time machine, it's not as if you're stepping out of time itself. You're just kind of in some sense reorganizing it. So what are the limits ultimately of temporal existence? I'm interested in how it is that contemporary discourse is about AI and what happens inside the black box of the machine, in some senses of no time, and how it is difficult for us as temporal users to really interface with this thing that is ostensibly able to produce outcomes that have no history, right? It's a fascinating time to be alive. That's it. Thank you.